I stood on my own land for the first time in 10 years when flashing lights cut through the dust behind me. The HOA had called the police on a man they thought was trespassing, never realizing the badge in my truck belonged to the chief who would decide their future. If you believe real justice still exists and power should answer to truth, subscribe now. Because stories like this only come out when someone finally refuses to back down. 10 years is a long time to be away from a place that once defined your entire life. The ranch had been my first assignment, my refuge, and my promise to myself that I would always remember where I came from. When I left, it wasn't because I wanted to. It was because life pulled me somewhere else, somewhere louder, faster, and heavier with responsibility. Now, a decade later, I returned not as the young man who once fixed broken fences under the sun, but as someone shaped by command, consequence, and hard-earned authority. The gravel road looked narrower than I remembered, curling toward the horizon like it was testing whether I truly belonged there anymore. Dust lifted behind my truck as the gate came into view, still standing, still bearing the faint outline of the old brand burned into the wood. I parked, stepped out, and let the silence settle around me. No sirens. No radios. Just wind moving through tall grass and the distant call of birds that hadn't changed a bit. This land had never been about appearances. It was rugged, practical, and honest. The kind of place where work spoke louder than words and ownership wasn't questioned because everyone knew who belonged. Or at least that used to be true. The first thing I noticed was the sign. Clean, white, professionally mounted. It didn't belong. It listed regulations, violations, fines, and contact numbers. A homeowners association logo sat at the top like a stamp of authority. I read it twice, slowly, not because I didn't understand it, but because I couldn't believe it applied here. The ranch wasn't part of any development when I left. There were no manicured lawns, no uniform fences, no committees deciding what color a door could be. Yet there it was, claiming jurisdiction over land that had existed long before their bylaws ever did. I drove past the gate and further in, the tires crunching softly over familiar ground. The house appeared unchanged, worn but strong, holding its posture against time. I walked the perimeter, noticing small differences. New fence sections. Fresh paint on neighboring properties just beyond the boundary. The area had grown, and with growth came people who believed order meant control. I was still taking it all in when I felt it. That subtle shift in the air that comes before conflict. The kind you learn to recognize after years in law enforcement. Engines in the distance. Tires on gravel that didn't belong to me. I turned as two patrol vehicles approached, lights flashing not urgently, but assertively. The kind of display meant to announce power rather than respond to danger. They stopped near the driveway, angled perfectly, trained for presence. Doors opened. Officers stepped out with measured confidence. I stayed where I was. Hands visible. Observing. From their perspective, I understood exactly what they saw. A man on property flagged by an HOA complaint. Possibly uncooperative. Possibly trespassing. They didn't see history. They didn't see deeds or memories. They saw a report and followed procedure. What surprised me wasn't that the call had been made. It was how quickly authority had been assumed by people who never once verified who actually owned the land. The HOA had acted first, confident enough to involve law enforcement over a situation they barely understood. I watched as the officers assessed the scene, their attention moving from me to the house, to the land, then back again. They weren't aggressive, but they were cautious, trained, professional. Exactly how I'd taught my own department to be. As I stood there, something settled deep inside me. Not anger. Not pride. Clarity. This moment wasn't about flexing rank or embarrassing anyone. It was about exposure. About showing how easily power can be misused when it isn't questioned. The ranch had been quiet for years, but now it was surrounded by people who believed rules applied equally, even when they didn't. The HOA had grown bold, accustomed to compliance, used to residents who didn't challenge letters or fines or threats. They had no idea they'd just stepped onto ground owned by someone who understood the system better than they ever would. I let the moment breathe. I let them do their job. Because I knew something they didn't yet know. This wasn't a misunderstanding that would end quietly. This was the beginning of a reckoning for an association that had mistaken authority for ownership. And as the dust settled around us, One truth became clear. They had called the police on the wrong man, on the wrong land, at exactly the wrong time. The ranch had waited 10 years for my return, and it wasn't about to stay silent any longer. The officers approached slowly, boots pressing into the dirt like they were stepping onto uncertain ground. I could tell by their posture they hadn't decided who controlled this situation yet. Experience teaches you to read those small details, the angle of the shoulders, the way a hand rests near a belt but doesn't touch it. They were doing everything by the book, which told me the call they received hadn't mentioned anything more than a possible trespasser and a non-compliant property owner. The younger officer spoke first, his voice steady, professional, rehearsed by years of training. He asked my name. I gave it without hesitation. He asked what business I had on the property. I told him the truth, calmly and clearly. I said I owned the land. I said I had just returned after 10 years away. I said there must be some confusion. Confusion was not what the HOA had intended. They wanted enforcement, not questions. They wanted pressure, not verification. And yet here we were, standing on soil that didn't care about committees or bylaws, watching authority slow down as reality crept in. The second officer stepped aside to check his tablet. I saw his expression change slightly as he pulled up property records. Not shock, not disbelief, just focus sharpening into something more serious. He looked from the screen back to me, then to the house, then back again. That was the moment the situation shifted from routine to delicate. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of dry grass and old wood. Somewhere in the distance, a gate creaked softly. Everything about the place felt patient, like it had seen worse storms than this. I stayed still, letting the process unfold. There was no need to rush truth. It always arrives on its own schedule. The officer cleared his throat and asked if I had identification. I reached into my truck slowly, deliberately, pulling out my wallet. Inside wasn't just a driver's license. It was a badge, worn at the edges, polished by years of use. I didn't flash it. I didn't announce it. I simply handed it over with the same calm respect I expected from my own people. The silence that followed was immediate and complete. Both officers froze for half a second too long. It wasn't fear. It was recognition. The kind that hits when the story you've been told suddenly collapses under its own weight. The badge didn't make me different. It made the situation undeniable. They straightened. Their tone changed, not deferential, but precise. The younger one handed the badge back carefully, as if the land itself was watching. He apologized for the inconvenience. He explained the call had come from the homeowners association bordering the property. Complaints of unauthorized access. Claims that the land was under HOA oversight. That was when I knew this wouldn't end with a simple correction. HOAs thrive on assumptions. On the belief that no one will challenge paperwork wrapped in authority. They rely on residents being busy, tired, or afraid of escalation. They hadn't expected the owner to return, and they certainly hadn't expected him to understand every lever of power they tried to pull. I told the officers I understood they were doing their jobs. I told them there was no issue with their presence. But I also made it clear the land was private, deeded, and never legally absorbed into any association. I spoke slowly, not to dominate, but to document. Every word mattered now. The officers exchanged a look. One of them nodded and stepped away to make a call. Not to the HOA. To their supervisor. Procedure demanded it. And procedure, when followed correctly, has a way of unraveling bad decisions. Minutes passed. The sun climbed higher. I could almost feel eyes watching from nearby houses, curtains pulled just enough to witness something they didn't understand. To them, this was enforcement. To me, it was exposure. The officer returned and confirmed what I already knew. The property records were clear. No HOA jurisdiction. No easements. No authority. The call had been made based on assumption, not fact. That detail alone carried weight. Before they left, I asked a simple question. Who had filed the complaint? They gave me the name of the HOA board president, along with a timestamp and recorded call reference. They didn't hesitate. Transparency is easy when you're on solid ground. As the patrol cars pulled away, the dust settled again, but the quiet felt different now. Charged. Like something irreversible had been set in motion. I stood there alone, the badge back in my wallet, the ranch stretching endlessly around me. The HOA thought this was about control. About keeping someone in line. They had no idea they just created a paper trail that would expose everything they'd been doing unchecked for years. I didn't return to the house right away. I walked the boundary instead, tracing lines that existed long before anyone tried to redraw them. I noticed markers that had been moved. Fences nudged inward. Small encroachments designed to go unnoticed. Each step confirmed what I suspected. This wasn't an isolated mistake. It was a pattern. And patterns, once documented, don't disappear. They escalate. The HOA had made a call they couldn't undo. They'd involved law enforcement where they had no authority. They'd created records that would now be scrutinized. And they'd done it to someone who knew exactly how systems break when arrogance replaces legality. As I reached the far edge of the property, my phone vibrated. A voicemail notification. Unknown number. I didn't need to listen to know who it was from. They had realized their mistake. But realization doesn't erase consequences. And what they didn't know yet was that this was only the beginning. I didn't listen to the voicemail right away. Experience had taught me that urgency is often a tool, not a necessity. When people realize they've crossed a line, they rush to speak before anyone else can frame the narrative. Silence, on the other hand, has a way of forcing truth to surface on its own. I finished walking the boundary, noting every place where intention had quietly replaced permission. The HOA hadn't just assumed authority, they'd been testing it, inch by inch, fence post by fence post. That kind of behavior doesn't start bold. It starts subtle, with the expectation that no one will notice, and grows into confidence when no one pushes back. By the time I returned to the house, the sun was high enough to expose details that shadows had hidden earlier. Tire tracks that didn't belong to me. Footprints near the fence line. Fresh stakes marking what they probably believed would soon be official boundaries. It was all there, laid out plainly, as if the land itself had been waiting for someone to finally look closely. I stepped inside the house and let the cool air settle my thoughts. The place smelled like dust and old wood, familiar in a way that didn't need explanation. I set my bag down, poured a glass of water, and finally listened to the message. The voice on the other end was careful, controlled, trying to sound reasonable while masking panic. The HOA president introduced herself formally, referenced a misunderstanding, and suggested a meeting to clear things up. She emphasized cooperation, community, and mutual respect, all the words people reach for when leverage slips from their hands. She didn't apologize. Not really. She framed the call as a necessary precaution, as if involving police on private property was simply part of responsible governance. That told me everything I needed to know. I saved the voicemail and locked the phone. This wasn't about resolving confusion anymore. This was about accountability. I spent the next few hours doing what I'd always done when preparing for something serious. I gathered facts. I pulled old records from my files, confirming dates, surveys, and deeds. I checked county maps and zoning changes that had occurred during my absence. Everything aligned exactly as I remembered. The ranch had remained independent, excluded deliberately from the development plans years ago. The HOA's authority stopped cleanly at my boundary. What had changed was the neighborhood's attitude. People get comfortable when no one challenges them. HOAs, in particular, thrive on routine compliance. Letters get sent. Fines get paid. Adjustments get made quietly to avoid conflict. Over time, that compliance becomes expectation, and expectation turns into entitlement. By late afternoon, another vehicle pulled up near the road. This one wasn't law enforcement. It was a black SUV with tinted windows and a magnetic HOA logo slapped on the side. They hadn't learned yet. Or maybe they thought a face-to-face conversation would smooth over what paperwork couldn't. I stayed inside and watched from the window as two people stepped out. One of them matched the voice from the voicemail. Confident posture, practiced smile, clipboard held like a shield. The other hovered slightly behind, observing, calculating. They waited. Then they walked closer to the house, stopping just short of the porch. They didn't knock. They stood there, expecting acknowledgement. I opened the door slowly and stepped out, keeping the interaction public, visible to anyone watching. Transparency matters when lines are being tested. The HOA president spoke first, launching into an explanation that sounded rehearsed. She referenced community standards, recent development changes, and concerns raised by neighboring residents. She talked about harmony and property values, about how my return had caused alarm. I listened without interrupting. Not because I agreed, but because every word she spoke added context to a pattern I was already documenting. She wasn't interested in law. She was interested in control framed as concern. When she finally paused, I responded calmly. I stated my name. I stated my ownership. I stated that the property was not, and had never been, under HOA jurisdiction. I referenced the police call, the records check, and the confirmation from their own county database. I told her the matter was no longer informal. Her expression tightened, just slightly. Authority challenged often reveals itself in small cracks before it breaks completely. She tried again, suggesting mediation, suggesting compromises, suggesting that formal escalation would benefit no one. That was the moment I knew she understood exactly what was at stake. I told her that involving law enforcement without verification wasn't a misunderstanding. It was misuse of authority. I told her boundary encroachments weren't accidents. They were deliberate. And I told her that any further attempts to assert control over my land would be documented and addressed appropriately. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't threaten. I didn't reveal my position again. I didn't need to. The truth had already shifted the balance. She asked what I wanted. That question always comes when someone realizes they're no longer in charge. I told her I wanted compliance with the law. Immediate removal of any markers, fences, or signage placed on my property. Written acknowledgement that the ranch was excluded from the HOA. And confirmation that no further enforcement actions would be taken. She hesitated, then said she would need to consult the board. That was expected. Boards exist to diffuse responsibility, to spread blame thin enough that no one feels it directly. But systems still answer to facts. As they left, I noticed neighbors watching openly now. No curtains. No pretense. Word had spread faster than I anticipated. Police. HOA. Ranch owner standing firm. People notice when the usual order wobbles. That evening, I made calls of my own. Not to intimidate, not to accelerate, but to prepare. County officials. Legal counsel. Internal affairs contacts who understood how improper police calls tied into broader patterns of misuse. By nightfall, the ranch felt alive again. Not because of conflict, but because purpose had returned to it. This land had always stood for something simple. Ownership. Responsibility. Limits. The HOA thought this was about rules. They were about to learn it was about overreach. And once overreach is proven, consequences follow paths no board vote can stop. Morning arrived quietly, the kind of quiet that only exists when tension has settled into the ground and is waiting for movement. The ranch felt different now, not hostile, but alert, as if it knew something was coming. Sunlight spread across the fields in long, deliberate strokes, revealing every line, every boundary, every place where assumption had tried to replace fact. I started the day methodically. I documented everything. Photographs of fence posts. Measurements of where markers had been placed. Time stamps, angles, distances. This wasn't paranoia. It was preparation. Systems don't respond to emotion. They respond to records. By mid-morning, my phone began to fill with notifications. Emails from county offices acknowledging receipt of inquiries. A confirmation from legal counsel that they were reviewing the materials I'd sent overnight. Quiet movements, but important ones. The kind that shift weight behind the scenes while the surface still looks calm. Then came the letter. It was hand-delivered, placed carefully at the edge of my porch like an offering meant to soften what couldn't be defended. Official letterhead. Formal language. The HOA board's response to my demands. They acknowledged receipt of my concerns, expressed regret for any distress caused, and stated they were conducting an internal review. Internal review. Those words are designed to sound proactive while buying time. They assume the other side will wait. They assume pressure fades when it isn't met immediately. That assumption works on most people. It doesn't work on someone who understands how delay can be weaponized. I read the letter twice, then set it aside. No response yet. Silence again. Let them fill it with their own anxiety. That afternoon, I noticed movement along the far fence line. A small group of workers, wearing neutral clothing, removing stakes and repainting boundary posts. Quiet compliance without acknowledgement. No apology. No admission. Just correction. It was a start. But correction without accountability only encourages repetition. As the sun dipped lower, a county vehicle pulled onto the access road. Not enforcement. Assessment. Two officials stepped out, clipboards in hand, surveying the land with professional detachment. They asked permission to walk the boundary. I granted it. Transparency again. They moved carefully, comparing maps to markers, confirming what I already knew. The HOA's reach had exceeded its authority in multiple places, not just on my land. Small encroachments, repeated often enough to redraw reality for those who didn't question it. One of the officials shook his head quietly as he made notes. Not anger. Disappointment. That reaction carried more weight than outrage ever could. By evening, word had spread beyond the neighborhood. Local meetings postponed. HOA board members suddenly unavailable. Phones unanswered. When authority realizes it may be examined, it retreats inward first. I took a walk as dusk settled, letting the ranch breathe again. The land didn't care about paperwork or power struggles. It responded to consistency. To someone finally standing where they belonged. I thought back to why I'd left in the first place. Career. Duty. The belief that serving at a higher level required sacrifice. I'd given years to systems designed to protect people from misuse of power. I hadn't expected to return and find my own land caught in a smaller version of the same problem. But patterns repeat across scales. Whether it's a city or a subdivision, authority unchecked behaves the same way. That night, another message came through. This one wasn't from the HOA. It was from a neighbor. Long-time resident. Someone who'd watched the association grow more aggressive over the years. The message wasn't confrontational. It was grateful. Quiet appreciation that someone had finally pushed back. That told me more than any letter ever could. People tolerate overreach until they see proof it can be challenged. The next morning, I received confirmation that a formal inquiry had been opened. Not criminal. Administrative. Oversight. The kind that reviews processes, communications, and decision-making. The kind that uncovers patterns when individual incidents are examined together. The HOA hadn't just called the police on me. They'd done it before. Multiple times. Different residents. Always framed as safety. Always lacking verification. Always counting on compliance. That pattern was now on record. I didn't celebrate. This wasn't victory. It was responsibility. Once you expose something like this, you don't get to walk away. You see it through, not for revenge, but for correction. By late afternoon, the HOA president requested another meeting. This time, the tone was different. No assumptions. No authority. Just urgency. I agreed, but not privately. The meeting would be documented, witnessed, and structured. The ranch had taught me patience. Law enforcement had taught me process. Both mattered now. As the day ended, I stood again near the gate where this had started. The sign was gone. The road was quiet. But the air carried the weight of consequence. The HOA thought control came from letters and calls and appearances. They were about to learn that real power comes from accountability. And once accountability enters the conversation, nothing stays hidden for long. Believe something systemic is at play. The board's response time stretched. Extensions requested. Clarifications sought. Every delay added weight to the file. That afternoon, I watched as a moving truck pulled up to one of the homes near the boundary. A board member, quietly relocating. No announcement. No farewell. Just departure. When people leave early, it's usually because they understand where things are headed. The ranch remained unchanged, steady as ever. I found myself repairing an old fence section, not because it was necessary, but because it grounded me. Manual work has a way of cutting through noise. Each post I set felt like a reaffirmation of something simple. This land exists independent of anyone's permission. Later that evening, another message arrived. This one from the HOA president. Short, direct, requesting a private conversation. No formal language. No committee references. Just a name and a number. I declined. Private conversations are where accountability dissolves, where misunderstandings are reframed and records conveniently don't exist. Transparency had carried this far. It would carry it the rest of the way. The next board meeting was different. Smaller crowd. Heavier atmosphere. Legal counsel sat at the table, not as support, but as constraint. Every sentence filtered. Every response cautious. A statement was read, carefully worded, acknowledging procedural errors. Committing to policy reform. Announcing a restructuring of the enforcement committee. It was the closest thing to an admission they were willing to offer publicly. It wasn't enough for some residents. Questions followed. Sharp ones. About past fines. About calls made. About who authorized what and when. The board answered what they could and deferred what they couldn't. Deferral, when repeated, becomes evidence. By the end of the meeting, 2 more board members had announced their resignation. Personal reasons. Always personal reasons. Responsibility rarely names itself directly. The inquiry concluded shortly after. The findings weren't dramatic, but they were decisive. Improper use of enforcement authority. Failure to verify jurisdiction. Inadequate oversight. Recommendations issued. Corrections mandated. Monitoring imposed. The HOA wasn't dissolved. That rarely happens. Instead, it was constrained. Boundaries clarified. Procedures rewritten. Oversight introduced. That's how real consequences look. Not collapse. Containment. A letter arrived at the ranch one final time. This one from the HOA's legal counsel. It confirmed, unequivocally, that the ranch was excluded from all present and future association governance. It acknowledged the improper police call. It stated that corrective measures had been taken. Still no apology. I didn't need one. An apology satisfies emotion. Accountability changes behavior. The neighborhood slowly returned to its routines, but something fundamental had shifted. People asked questions now. Notices were read carefully. Authority was no longer assumed. I walked the land again at sunset, the same way I had on the first day back. The difference was unmistakable. Not in the terrain but in the air. The ranch felt settled, not because conflict had ended, but because truth had been established. 10 years away had changed me. It had taught me systems, hierarchy, consequence. Returning had reminded me why those lessons matter. Power doesn't exist to be exercised freely. It exists to be restrained properly. The HOA had called the police thinking it would silence a problem. Instead, it had amplified one. And in doing so, it reminded an entire community of something they had slowly forgotten. Authority ends where ownership begins. The fallout didn't arrive all at once. It came in fragments, spread across weeks, showing itself in small but unmistakable ways. Power, when it retreats, rarely does so dramatically. It fades, leaving behind gaps where certainty once stood. I noticed it first in the silence. No letters. No warnings. No carefully worded notices taped to doors or mailed with threatening deadlines. The HOA office lights were often off now, even during hours they once insisted were mandatory for community operations. Control had required presence. Accountability required caution. Neighbors who had once avoided eye contact now waved openly. Some stopped to talk, not about rules or disputes, but about ordinary things. Weather. Property repairs. The quiet relief of not feeling watched. It wasn't gratitude they showed. It was ease. And ease is what people feel when pressure lifts. The ranch settled back into itself, returning to the rhythm it had always known. Morning light across open land. Wind moving without obstruction. Boundaries respected because they were clear, not because they were enforced. I spent my days repairing what time had worn down, not rushing, not proving anything. Just restoring. One afternoon, a county official returned, not for inspection, but to close a file. He walked the boundary one last time, checked notes, and confirmed everything matched the records now. Before leaving, he paused and said something that stayed with me. He said most cases like this never reach resolution because people give up halfway through. Not because they're wrong, but because persistence costs time and energy. That was the unspoken advantage HOAs rely on. Fatigue. They overwhelm residents with paperwork, deadlines, and the threat of escalation, counting on exhaustion to secure compliance. This time, fatigue hadn't won. News traveled beyond the development. Nearby communities began asking questions of their own associations. Policy reviews quietly started elsewhere. When one structure weakens, others take notice. Systems learn from each other, especially when liability is involved. I received an email from a neighboring HOA requesting guidance on jurisdiction boundaries. Not officially, not publicly, just a question, carefully phrased. That told me everything. They were watching. The board at my development changed almost entirely within 2 months. New faces, new tone. Meetings focused on maintenance instead of enforcement. Language shifted from demands to requests. Authority recalibrated itself around caution. I didn't attend those meetings anymore. I didn't need to. My presence had served its purpose. Staying would have turned responsibility into dominance, and that was never the goal. Late one evening, I sat on the porch and watched headlights move along the road beyond the fence. Life continuing. Order restored, not through force, but through correction. That distinction mattered. I thought about the call that started everything. One decision, made casually, based on assumption instead of verification. A call placed with confidence, not caution. It hadn't been malicious. That was the most dangerous part. It had been routine. Routine misuse of authority is how systems drift from purpose to control. The officers who responded that day never followed up. They didn't need to. Their professionalism had held. The system worked because individuals did their jobs correctly when it mattered. That balance is fragile. It relies on people remembering why rules exist in the first place. I considered how easily this could have gone differently. If I hadn't returned when I did. If I hadn't known how to document, how to wait, how to let process unfold. The ranch might have slowly disappeared into someone else's jurisdiction without a single dramatic moment. Just paperwork and pressure, quietly reshaping reality. That's how most overreach succeeds. The lesson wasn't about me. It was about attention. About reading what you're handed instead of assuming it's correct. About understanding that authority doesn't grow because it's right, but because it's unchallenged. As summer turned, the land thrived. Grass taller. Fences strong. Silence comfortable. The HOA no longer appeared in conversations. That absence spoke louder than their presence ever had. One final letter arrived months later. Not from the board. From an insurance carrier. It confirmed revised coverage terms and noted that enforcement-related claims would now be excluded without verification procedures. Liability had reshaped policy. Exactly as expected. I filed the letter away and closed the drawer. The ranch didn't need reminders of what it had endured. It needed care, not documentation. I walked the boundary one last time that evening, stopping where the sign had once stood. The ground still bore faint marks where it had been mounted. Evidence of something temporary that believed it was permanent. I brushed the dirt smooth with my boot. Power that forgets its limits always leaves marks. Power that's corrected leaves lessons. As the sun disappeared beyond the horizon, I realized something simple and final. Returning after 10 years hadn't been about reclaiming land. It had been about restoring balance. The HOA had mistaken absence for surrender. They had learned otherwise. And while the ranch stood unchanged, the people around it understood something new. Ownership isn't loud. Authority isn't assumed. And silence, when paired with truth, is stronger than any threat ever issued. Time has a way of revealing what conflict conceals. Weeks passed, then months, and the ranch settled into a quiet that felt earned rather than accidental. The noise that once hovered at the edges, letters, meetings, notices, the constant suggestion of oversight, had faded completely. Not because someone had declared an ending, but because the structure that produced it had been corrected and constrained. I noticed the change in the smallest details. The road stayed clear.
No unfamiliar vehicles slowed near the gate. No workers appeared measuring lines that weren't theirs to touch.
The land existed again without explanation. That was the real outcome. Not victory, not punishment. Normalcy restored. People in the surrounding community adjusted slowly. Habits don't break overnight. Some still glanced toward the ranch as they passed, remembering the tension, the sudden awareness that authority could be questioned. Others moved on quickly, relieved that the pressure they'd felt for years had finally lifted. The HOA itself became quieter, more procedural, less ambitious. Meetings shortened. Agendas narrowed. Enforcement language softened into maintenance discussion and shared responsibility. The new board focused on what associations are supposed to manage, not what they think they can control. Oversight had done its job. I never received a personal apology, and I never expected one. Apologies can be performative. Change is measurable. What mattered was that the misuse of authority had stopped. The calls. The assumptions. The quiet redrawing of lines without consent. Those things don't end because someone is embarrassed. They end because systems are forced to recognize their limits. The ranch thrived in that recognition. I spent my days repairing structures that had waited patiently for attention. Fences straightened. Gates reinforced. The house itself slowly returned to life, room by room, as if it had been holding its breath during my absence. There was satisfaction in work that didn't need permission. Occasionally, someone would ask me why I hadn't escalated further, why I hadn't pushed for penalties or public consequences. The answer was always the same. Correction was the goal, not spectacle. When systems are fixed, they protect more people than punishment ever could. The officers who responded that first day never crossed my path again. Their involvement had been professional, limited, and necessary. They were never the issue. They had acted on information provided to them. The problem had been the confidence with which that information was presented. That distinction matters.
Authority doesn't become dangerous because it exists.
It becomes dangerous when it's trusted without verification. When questions are discouraged. When silence is mistaken for agreement. The community learned that lesson quietly. And quiet lessons tend to last longer. As summer faded into fall, I walked the boundary one last time, not out of vigilance, but ritual. The land looked the same as it always had, unchanged by paperwork or conflict. Nature doesn't recognize jurisdiction. It responds only to care and consistency. I paused where the first patrol car had stopped months earlier. The ground showed no sign of it now. No tracks. No disturbance. Just Earth doing what it has always done, absorbing events and moving forward. Returning after 10 years had been unexpected in its impact. I thought I was coming back to reclaim a place. Instead, I had been placed in the middle of a lesson that needed to be taught, not through confrontation, but through process. The HOA hadn't known who I was when they made that call. That fact had never mattered. What mattered was that they hadn't known who owned the land they tried to control. Authority should never move faster than verification. When it does, it creates its own reckoning. That reckoning had come and gone quietly. The ranch stood alone again, independent, unbothered, exactly as it was meant to be. The community around it functioned better for having been corrected. Not because someone had won, but because something had been clarified.
I locked the gate that evening and stood for a moment, listening to the wind move through open space.
There was no tension left in it. No unresolved pressure. Just distance and calm. 10 years away had changed me, but returning had reminded me of something essential. Power is temporary. Ownership is permanent. And systems only work when someone is willing to stop, look closely, and insist they do. The HOA had called the police believing it would assert control. Instead, it restored balance. And balance, once re-established, doesn't announce itself. It simply remains.